Welcome to This Is Money podcast. I'm Georgie Frost, out in Sharm el-Sheikh for the COP Climate Conference, and joining me and editor Simon Lambert in London today is pensions and investments editor Tanya Jeffries. And coming up, the everything tax raid. Any tax you can think of is rumoured to be hiked, capital gains, inheritance, even the 50p tax return. But why are these ideas being floated, and what could really happen? And will pension relief get raided? Also today we ask, should you still de-risk your pension? Victory over care home fee top-ups, and should you overpay your mortgage now that rates are rocketing? Don't forget you can stay up to date with all the latest breaking money news. Just go to thisismoney.co.uk or download the app.
Market updates and conversations around the financial world don't have to be boring. The Digest and Invest podcast by eToro is a great way to tune into what's happening in a fun and easily digestible format. Discover the Digest and Invest podcast at etoro.com/academy/podcasts.
But first, I mentioned that I'm in COP, not because we are massively going to talk about it too much, but for the fact that there might be some noise here. I am in one of the halls with pretty scratchy internet, but here we are, ploughing on.
All right, Georgie. So, I'm going to turn the tables on you. It's my turn to ask you the questions.
Right.
So what's it like then?
What's it like?
Yeah.
It's my first time here, and it is a little bit like a cross between a political party conference, don't know if you've ever been to one of those, and a travel expo. Actually, look, as someone whose dad is a geophysicist and finds oil, there was, I wouldn't say necessarily neutral on the climate debate, but certainly not necessarily someone whose job and life was revolving around it. I have to say, coming out here has changed my perspective. I've got a chance to talk to representatives from Pakistan, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from Tuvalu, from countries and states that are impacted by climate change and the extreme weather events we're seeing at the moment, and it does put a different spin on it. And as much as I get the argument, and probably would have advocated this argument before I came out here about, oh, look at these people flying in their private jet, hypocrisy, and plastic water bottle in front of me under extremely strong air conditioning. I mean, we are in the middle of Egypt, but the conversations that people have, you just cannot have them on Zoom. I mean, it's a completely different environment. I'm just walking along the street from the hotel to my restaurant, and a representative from the Kenyan government just says hello and then starts talking about innovation projects in his country, which, you don't get in London. I wouldn't believe him if I did. But it's those sort of conversations that you just can't have. And I think it's sort of a small price to pay getting important people out here to discuss an issue which is pretty important.
What sort of amount of people and representatives are there, though? Because, I mean, obviously we think about world leaders and people who were previously world leaders, i.e. Boris, doing their bit. But is it just a massive Beano with everyone, the world and their wife and their husband or their significant other all out there just roaming around? Or is it actually people who are actively engaged in trying to do something about the climate change issue, and actually those people getting there and sharing ideas and meeting face to face does pay off?
It's hard to tell, Simon. I mean, there's 44,000 people reportedly registered for this event. I've not met them all, so I can't say what all of them do. But it does seem to be some, like I said, this kind of travel expo, political party conference, exactly what you'd expect. Little areas where people have set up, each country's got their own stall set out, and people are having, every time you walk past someone, there is some conversation being had about some sort of, I don't know, new technology or ideas being spread around. I don't know how much of it's sort of just shaking hands with people and getting to know clients and new business deals and stuff. But it does seem to me that conversations are being had, and it seems a good place to do it. And actually, talking about that whole business deal idea is, I don't mean that disparagingly, because actually one of the big emphasis, certainly in last year, was business involvement, seeing climate action as a business opportunity. And that's, if that's what it takes to get businesses on side and investments in things like adaptation and resilience and all the things, the buzz phrases that we're talking about here, then that's what has to be done here. But it's interesting. Honestly, I've never been to this before, so it is really illuminating to be out here.
Well, it's interesting, that point on business, because I think this is something that we've reflected on before when we've talked about investing and how there's a tailwind behind investing in stuff that does deal with the climate, that does deal with renewable energy. I've actually spoken to the fund manager of Scottish Mortgage this week, and he was telling me about how decarbonisation is a major theme of theirs, and that they need to get businesses involved because, quite frankly, nations don't actually have any money to do it themselves, which is a neat little segue back to you and what we're going to talk about.
Well, yes, exactly. So there we go. Apologies for any noise. I am here at COP27. So let's get back to business, back to the UK. And it seems that nothing is off the table when it comes to tax raids in the Chancellor's upcoming autumn budget. Jeremy Hunt has a 50 billion plus black hole in the public finances to fill. So what is ripe for picking? We've got loads of rumours: inheritance tax, capital gains, dividends, pensions. Let's delve into some of the rumours, see what is likely to come about. Firstly, Simon, though, just give us an overview, set us up nicely, scene set for us. What is the situation with the public finances? Why are we in a situation where, hang on, not so long ago, we were getting money, money thrown, investment, all that sort of thing. Now it's back to sort of austerity Mark 2.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to encapsulate it into one sentence, perhaps you could say first we had the clowns and now we have the fun police, stepping in to make sure that we are not going to be having any fun anytime soon. Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak are very serious about getting our house in order, and they want us to know that they're very serious about getting our house in order. And I have never seen anything like the wild amount of kite flying that has gone on for tax rises over the last couple of weeks. We said we'd never seen anything like the fallout of the mini budget. You had to hark back to financial crisis times for some of that. But this has been astonishing. I mean, we've had some chancellors who've done some kite flying in the past, and it's a well-known, thing to do. You go, well, maybe we'll raise this, maybe we'll raise that. You get a couple of rumors out, get a couple of stories going, see what the reactions are like, where the land lies. Maybe you're doing a bit of pitch rolling, that kind of thing. I mean, anything and everything you could possibly think of. I mean, the other day, we might have the 50p tax rate back. We were only getting rid of the 45p tax rate not that long ago. It's completely mad. Inheritance tax, that's a stealth one. Capital gains tax, we talk about that going up. Dividends, talk about that going up. The dividend tax, that's going up anyway because we cancelled the cut to it. Corporation tax, that's definitely going back up because we cut that, but now it's going back up. It's absolutely mad. And we've even had that old chestnut pension tax relief landed on the block as well. So actually, on a more serious note than what I was just saying, I don't think this is a particularly good move here. I understand there is this desire to get a grip on our finances. There is this talk of this alleged £50 billion fiscal black hole. There is a lack of explanation as to exactly what this £50 billion fiscal black hole is or where it's come from. It's a sort of nominal hole in the future based on some of the stuff that's happened and what might happen. And it's a matter that's up for debate as to whether it is that bad or whether it isn't that bad. We are, it seems, risking austerity Mark 2 here. Is that what you want to be doing as you go into a recession at the point where the low interest rate world is ending? We've seen interest rates move up substantially. Mortgage rates have gone from below 2.5% a year ago to 6.5% now. Anybody facing remortgaging is looking at hundreds of pounds a month extra. People's energy bills have doubled. The energy price guarantee was put in place to try and give people some certainty for 2 years. That's now been ripped up and it's only going to last till April. People are not feeling great about their finances right now. They're likely to hunker down. They're likely to stop spending. And quite frankly, the messaging coming across from this, we might raise every single tax that we can possibly think of, might be that what they're doing, I get what they're doing here, is when they do then deliver the rises, everybody's going to think, okay, well, at least that wasn't as bad as it could have been. But the problem is people are thinking, well, if they don't do it now, they might do it next time. They might do it next time. They might do it next time. And we're getting a budget a month at the moment. So you run the risk of getting people to hunker down even more. And that's not going to be great in terms of trying to stave off a recession. And I raise my hat to David Smith of the Times, who in his column this week, I think best encapsulated it with, indeed, it is open season for pre-budget rumours. If somebody said the government was going to revive the old window tax, introduced under William III and not repealed until 1851, you wouldn't rule it out.
Oh, I'm kind of grateful to be out here. Tanya, before we delve into the details of those rumours, do you agree with Simon there? Is this going to help?
No, this kite flying is absolutely astonishing, and no, it is not going to help. I said to Simon the other day that I don't think they've got enough time or money to do some proper focus groups, so they're just flying all these kites to see what reaction they get. If it's ferocious enough, then maybe they'll think again. But they're cobbling something together really quickly. One of the repercussions of the mini budget, the disastrous mini budget, is we're in a position now where they feel they have to show the international markets what they're going to do, rather than just tell them we've got a decent medium-term plan to meet our debts. We'll announce a few things that to trim our sails, but you can rely on us. Now we're not trusted as much anymore. And they're scrabbling to get back into a position where we are, but they feel that they've got things to prove to the international markets now. And Simon is really right to talk about the impact of going into draconian spending cuts and tax rises when we're on the verge of what seems like a really nasty recession as a result of the mini budget disaster and having to spell out a lot of these things now. Then the fear is a lot of things that would have really helped the economy will be chucked out as well. Capital projects, which are, the good kind of investment, where you're really investing in infrastructure, schools, people's health. Health is part of the country's infrastructure. Healthy people do a better job and are more productive. The worry is that we'll end up having a deeper recession because of the mistakes that are being made now as a result of the mistakes that were made over the mini budget. It's not a very happy picture. And in terms of the amount of kite flying has just so it's completely confused everybody. I'm getting press releases from our usual contacts who always send us big previews. They're listing 10 items on them, or more items, as to things that might be changing. Everyone is completely flummoxed as to what might happen now Thursday.
All right, well, let's have a go, shall we? Simon, capital gains tax, what's being mooted?
What's being suggested with the capital gains tax is the thing that's been suggested with capital gains tax for ever and a day recently, which is capital gains tax will rise to be at the same level as income tax. So at the moment, rates are lower. And actually, rates of capital gains tax are lower because the idea is that in order to pay capital gains tax, you have taken some kind of risk, whether it's entrepreneurial, okay, so you pay lower rates for capital gains tax if you're selling your own business, whether it is investment, and we want people to invest. We want people to invest their money into the stock market, into companies, into individual companies. We give them tax breaks in order to do it. We want people to invest into the property market. I mean, landlords pay a higher rate of capital gains tax on their profits than other people do. But going back to the conversation we had on the podcast 2 weeks ago about this sort of crashing of the rental market as we hounded landlords out of it, and now we're finding that tenants are suffering because there aren't enough properties to rent, rents are going up, and all these problems. You do want people to actually do that. So that's why capital gains tax rates are lower. But it's easy to paint that as unfair. Why should someone who's got capital, right, and the ability to invest it, okay, why should they pay less tax than the working man or working woman who has to go out and earn a crust? And so that's where the whole, right, let's equalize this, let's raise the rates, and it means that the fat cats pay more. The collateral damage of this is individual investors. There are people who have built up investment pots that are outside of an ISA. The ISA allowance is pretty big nowadays. It's £20,000 a year. There's lots of people who would struggle to get anywhere near £20,000 a year, but it wasn't that high all along. It's only gone up to that level relatively recently. And there are people who've built up, not pensions, but pots for their retirement, pots that they live on, that are invested outside of an ISA. And if we raise capital gains tax, then they will get hit. Also, you have to remember that when capital gains tax rates were cut, there was this system that was introduced whereby you add your capital gain to your other income, which then decides what rate of capital gains tax you pay, whether you pay it at the basic rate level or whether you pay it at the higher rate level. And this has sort of pushed two taxes together, which are totally separate, income tax and capital gains tax. So actually lots more people do already pay the higher rate of capital gains tax if they make a meaningful gain. But will it go up? I don't know. I mean, they've held firm on not doing it so far. And as with any of these things, there are actually a number of elements that complicate it. For example, people can offset their losses and so on. It could happen, capital gains tax. I think it's probably a 3 in 5 chance, maybe.
3 in 5, Simon? Tanya, businesses, how are they going to get hit potentially?
Well, corporation tax, as Simon said, is now going to be going up as planned. That obviously is going to have a serious impact on the level of investment that they're going to be able to put in. Business investment in this country is really low, and it has been for a really long time. It runs behind the level in the EU and in the US, and there seems no prospect of that changing. Obviously, after the mini budget, as part of showing that we're fiscal probity, Sunak and Hunt kind of had to reverse the corporation tax decision. But long term, it's going to further undermine the situation businesses are in.
Dividend tax?
Well, there at the moment you've got an allowance of £2,000, and the rates on dividend tax vary depending on what your income tax rate is. Its basic rate 8.75%, higher rate 33.75%, and additional rate 39.35%. They could obviously cut the allowance further. But, as Simon says, the people who hold shares outside of ISAs and pay, dividend tax could well be affected by this.
And again, it's worth making the point here, as Tanya says, that it's individual investors who get hit here, and they're collateral damage. So some of this capital gains tax stuff is to do with genuine fat cats, people who've been paid loads of money in shares, for example, or have built up, those big stakes and they sell them. It's the people with lots of capital. But actually, it's the people with smaller amounts of capital who are going to get hit by this, the people with the smaller investments. And again, with dividends, one of the reasons why the dividend tax-free allowance was initially introduced was because dividend tax rates were increased. So it used to be that there was no tax for basic rate taxpayers, and then the higher rate level was 25%. That was raised in 2016, but a £5,000 tax-free dividend allowance was introduced. And the reason why this happened was to try and crack down on people paying themselves in dividends from working as limited companies rather than paying income tax. And so it's to try and limit that. But then that dividend tax rate, that dividend tax-free threshold was cut from 5,000 to 2,000. And now we're talking about it being cut to 1,000. And the tax on dividends has gone up because the national insurance element and social levy, which was removed, but is going to remain in place on the bit that was added to dividends. So you can see where the sort of collateral damage element comes in here. And then also, just to one final thing I forgot to mention on the capital gains tax and kite flying, we even saw that one of, maybe they'll remove the capital gains tax exemption for selling your own home. So most people just think that if they sell their own home, they just, it's literally just tax-free. There's just, you don't have to worry about it, which it is, but that's only because there's actually an exemption. So in the government's mind, you should be paying capital gains tax when you sell your own home, but they are kind enough to have given us all an exemption.
Right.
So if you do sell
Okay.
your own home, you don't pay capital gains tax. In the public's mind, it's just there is no capital gains tax that you'd ever have to pay on selling your own home. So this idea was raised. Well, what about if we remove that? I mean, think about the amount of money that could bring in. And it would bring in a huge amount of money. I mean, I think it would be the end of the government as well.
That's what the survey says on that 1 out of 5.
But,
After already messing with our mortgages.
I'm giving removing the capital gains tax exemption on selling your own home a -2 out of 5 chance of coming in. Okay, but this just does illustrate this stuff, and I think, I don't know, but when people read all these things and they see all these things and it's just bombarding them from left and right, it does have a really big impact on sentiment, and people are really finding things a bit tight at the moment. Even people who have quite a bit of money are finding things tight at the moment. This is a point where you do start to question whether the people who are in charge, who have a lot of money, actually, how much do they empathize with the wider population? How much can they really be in tune with the wider population and really understand quite how much all of this stuff rattling around the place has an impact on how people are feeling and how they will behave economically? I think it's a question worth asking.
Can I just say something about the CGT on your own home issue? We already have a real problem because of stamp duty with people, hanging on to property. If they face CGT potentially as well, then people would be disinclined to ever sell. One commentator this week did say, well, if you did apply CGT to own homes, well, then you'd have to get rid of stamp duty. But then you just sort of be replacing one thing that was gumming up the housing market with another. Like Simon says, there seems to be no real thinking about what people do in the real world. I mean, people are already deterred from selling because of stamp duty. Why would you move, every 5 years and give loads of extra money to the government? People don't do that.
And logically speaking, removing stamp duty and introducing some form of capital gains-based tax instead makes perfect sense, because with stamp duty, one of the great problems with the way that successive governments since Gordon Brown started tinkering have cashed in on this one is it is a sort of capital gains tax, but it's paid by the person who hasn't made the gain. It's based on the price of the property. So you're effectively paying a tax that's based on the profit of the person who's selling it to you. There's not many taxes that work that way. And if you were going to totally redo the system, you would put forward the case for removing stamp duty, replacing it with some form of capital gains tax. You would introduce something that avoids a double taxation scenario, i.e. someone paid 20 grand in stamp duty to buy a property, and then they're going to get hit with the capital gains tax element on top of that. You would have to also arguably reintroduce something like the taper allowance that used to exist and rewarded people for long-term ownership of assets. Again, this was something that was removed when capital gains tax rates were cut. And it was sort of a swap, wasn't it? It was like, well, we'll cut the rate, but we're going to remove your taper relief. And taper relief was pretty valuable to people who held onto assets for a long time. I would say two things. A, I don't think that there's been anywhere near enough time to possibly have thought out any system like this properly, but then I only give taking off the capital gains tax on your own home as a -2 out of 5 chance. But even with some of these other tax rises, I don't think some of this stuff has been thought through properly. And B, when was the last time you remembered the government doing something like that with the tax and going up, but in order to make it fair, we will sort it out over here? The direction of travel over the past decade has been to just completely ignore that principle and just go, well, we'll just keep squeezing at both ends and it'll just be absolutely fine.
Yeah, indeed. One area that doesn't affect many people actually, but seems to affect people emotionally, if that's the right word, is inheritance tax. We hate it. We absolutely hate it. But really, what is it? Still about 5% of people actually pay it. What's the speculation here?
Stealth tax raid. Don't put up the level at which it gets paid. Which I mean, to be honest, hasn't gone up anyway.
See last week's podcast for that.
Yeah, but to extend the stealth element of that, so that basically we would freeze that level, so everybody has a inheritance tax free amount, effectively, which is called the nil rate band, and below that, if your estate is below that, there is no inheritance tax to pay. That is £375,000 per individual, and couples can double it up, so you can pass it on to your spouse or your civil partner, so that makes it effectively £650,000. On top of that, we then had this own home allowance introduced, which started at £125,000 each, gone up slightly. And that means that effectively a married couple or civil partners could give away an estate worth £1 million, and there would be no inheritance tax to pay. And as you say, it doesn't really affect that many estates, but we hate it. The reason being that it disproportionately affects a chunk of the country for whom their home's value eats up increasingly more of that £1 million. Well, great for them, unearned wealth and so on and so on, except they're the same people whose children struggle to be able to afford a home in their hometown, and then all these other problems, So it's, again, a problem of high house prices. And also the reason why people hate it so much is because the people that do pay it, the estates do end up handing over very substantial sums of money, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pounds potentially. And that feels like a major hit. House prices, if you look since the pandemic, 2020, gone up 25%. It's obvious why the government is very interested in freezing the threshold, dragging more people into it, taking a bit more money off people. Also, when you consider that, we're talking about the baby boomer generation who've got more wealth than any generation before or after them. So you can see why they're tempted. But again, to go back to an old one of mine, I think there's an easy solution to inheritance tax. You basically just charge it at a lower rate. 40% is a huge amount. It's nearly half. Make it 20%. People wouldn't mind. They go, okay, fine. Well, 20%, I don't like paying it, but 20% sounds reasonable. And I actually think you get more people paying it and less people avoiding it.
Another reason why I think it's a deeply frustrating tax is that those people who are super duper duper wealthy find ways to get around it, legitimate ways. I mean, not suggesting anything dodgy going on, Tanya, but it does seem to be sort of those who house prices, they've benefited from the house price boom, or the sort of middle earners that have crept over the limit, and it is 40%, an enormous amount. What do you think?
Yeah, they are increasingly getting dragged into it. And we did a couple of years ago do a story about this, and we included a chart. I think it might have been from the Bank of England, but it showed how the tax take, the proportion of tax take, really goes up for people who are wealthy, but not super wealthy. And then proportionally, the tax take goes down for at the very, very wealthy end. And I think it's just a matter of the amount of advice you get on how to avoid it, and the options open to you when you're very, very wealthy that makes that more possible. But it is one of those things that does seem very unfair and galling. I think people need to try and remember that most people don't pay it. A lot of the people who reply to surveys saying how much they hate it are not going to have to pay it. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's great that they're getting so exercised on behalf of other people, but I mean, there's so many other taxes that you do have to pay that some of which are going to be changed or tinkered with in this forthcoming autumn statement, that really I think people need to, unless they've done the sums and really think that they're going to be in for it, to maybe take some of the emotion out of it.
There are some unintended consequences of it as well, where it kind of warps scenarios. I mean, one of the popular ways for the very wealthy to avoid inheritance tax is farmland, buying farms. It has to be farmed, but they just pay someone to farm it for them. And then they can tie up a load of their money in an asset that has gone up in price, gone up in value over recent years, and they can pass it on free of inheritance tax. That's obviously not an option that's open to most people, and probably not open to the people Tanya was talking about, where this curve goes up and then starts to go down. So it hits this kind of like £1 million to £3 million wealth bracket, which are very wealthy people by all standards, but they're not the people buying up the farms. But the unintended consequence of this is it makes it even harder for anybody who wants to get into farming, because, you know, it's already hard enough for them to ever have a hope of being able to buy their own farm or buy their own farmland. But they're not just going up against people, other farmers or bigger farmers who've got huge farms and buy up any land that comes up for sale, or going up against people just investing in farmland. They're going up against very wealthy people who are buying it because it helps them avoid tax, and therefore they can afford to pay more for it because they can factor in, well, you know, effectively it's 40% off for me.
Indeed. One final one on this one before we move on. Tanya, pensions. Will they get raided?
Oh, well, pension tax relief comes up again and again, as I think we mentioned earlier. It's probably worth just recapping how it works. The principle is that you save for retirement out of untaxed income, which means that you get tax relief at your income tax rate level, 20%, 40%, 45%. This has been the case for forever, basically. But every time there really is a fiscal event and governments are feeling financial pressure, it gets floated that there might be a change to this, particularly the idea that there'd be a flat rate. So that would mean that people who were getting higher rates of tax relief because they pay more tax would get less tax relief. People on, say, the basic rate, if it was a very stingy system, they might introduce it at 20%, so it would make no difference to them. Or they could put a tax relief rate at, say, 30% or something like that, so that they could claim that people who were lower earners were actually making something out of the overhaul. The trouble is, it is so complicated, and if it wasn't so complicated, a government would have done this long ago, because it would raise a lot of money. There is a big bill for paying pension tax relief. It's just that it would be massively unpopular. And it would also, for many sort of obscure technical reasons to do with final salary pensions, be an absolutely massive headache to implement it. It's not the kind of thing that you can knock together a plan on quickly in a couple of weeks. It probably, is a 6 to 9 months project ahead of an autumn statement next year if you've got really, really serious about it. I mean, anything can happen. They really need to raise some money, so they might just decide, oh, whatever, we're going to go for it this time. I personally think it's unlikely, and that it will get shelved again. But if they really, really want to drum up cash, then they will start planning it for the future.
The survey says, Simon, out of 5 for pensions.
Cutting pension tax relief. Oh, I would give that a 1 out of 5, to be honest. I think it's really complicated. So as Tanya said, you need to spend quite a lot of time thinking about this. They definitely haven't had long enough to think about it. Implications for final salary. Also salary sacrifice. What do you do about people who say you'd have to basically tear up the entire salary sacrifice scheme that a lot of pension schemes run on, because otherwise those people would still be getting full relief. Whereas people whose pension didn't operate under salary sacrifice wouldn't. So not happening this week. Not happening.
All right, that's it for part 1.
I'm joined now by Ben Laidler of eToro for our weekly look at what's been going on the markets. Ben, how's the last week been?
Pretty good. Global markets had another very strong week. 2 things: signs that inflation's coming down in the US, and secondly, China loosening off on its zero COVID restrictions on the economy. This helped boost the pound, also helped keep gilt bond yields stable. And this came even as we had some pretty depressing UK GDP data. The economy shrank in the last 3 months, and effectively the recession got started. FTSE 100 a bit more subdued, digesting some recent strong gains, and it's still the best performing big stock market in the world this year, shockingly.
And what do we have to look forward to on the markets next week?
A pretty big week. We've got the government's autumn budget statement on Thursday, where we're all braced for the £50 billion of tax hikes and spending cuts that seem to be coming our way. And to add insult to injury, we've also got the inflation report coming on Wednesday, where prices are set to rise towards 11%.
Welcome back. Sticking with pensions and reader question time. Many people seem to have lost big sums from their pensions recently because their pots were being de-risked or lifestyled before retirement, and they got hit in the bond market crash. This is worrying me. How does lifestyling work? At what point will it start? And should I opt out and stay in the stock market, not bonds, since I plan to keep my pension invested via income drawdown rather than buy an annuity in retirement? I am in the default fund of a big workplace pension scheme. So will lifestyling happen automatically? And what's the best way to preempt it? There are a lot of questions in here, Tanya. Firstly, what happened? What is this reader talking about in terms of lifestyling and bond market crashes? And just give me the context.
Well, when you're in the run-up to retirement, lots of people are in their default pension fund if they've never made any decisions about where they want to invest. And what schemes tend to do with these default funds in the run-up to retirement is de-risk, or what is known in financial jargon as lifestyle them, which basically means starting quite gradually, usually over about 10 years, moving people's investments out of what are deemed riskier stocks into what are deemed safer government and corporate bonds, mostly government bonds probably. But the trouble when we talk about the bond crash, what we've seen this year is not only have the well publicised, there have been well publicised stock market losses, but there also has been real problems in the bond market as well. And we saw this after the mini budget, particularly, which worsened the situation. Basically, the price of bonds crashed and people were sitting on lots of losses. Now, circling back to what this means for people in pension funds whose money has been moved into bonds, they were already affected by stock market losses. And what happened, and it is fairly unusual for the bond losses to kick in at the same time, but they basically are suffering a double whammy. We've seen this a lot with people writing into Steve Webb's column, and he's answered a few questions about it. But some of the people writing in have really lost a lot of money when they're right on the verge of retirement because they have belatedly realised they're in something called a lifestyling fund, which they didn't even realise they were in. In the past, the reason for being in those, having lifestyling, was a good and sensible one because people would buy an annuity, and therefore you wanted to take all the risk that you could out of your pension fund just before you retired and sort of crystallised your fund and bought an annuity. Obviously, a lot of people stay invested now, and there's a real question mark over whether it's a good idea to do any de-risking at all. If you're really planning to spend your entire retirement invested in the stock market, then why de-risk at all? Or even if you're planning to have a mixture of, in bonds and stock market investments, you might still, with potentially 30 years to go, at 65, 66, be thinking, well, it's not yet time to start moving into safer investments. So really, the reason we ran this question is we've published articles with all sorts of mitigation strategies that people can employ if they are sitting on massive losses just as they're about to retire. But this was really a look at what do you do if this hasn't happened to you yet. You're looking ahead. Should you be doing this at all? When pension freedoms came in 2015, 2019, we did actually write an article about this. Should you still de-risk? I think was the line then, and it still holds true now. You need to think about this very carefully. We got a couple of experts to answer this and gave some advice to people who are considering it. But the things to really weigh up are you going to buy an annuity? Rates have improved, so you might be more inclined to do that now. Or are you going to stay invested in retirement? And you need to engage with your pension scheme and let them know your wishes so that you aren't caught out on the brink of retirement saying what just happened, which unfortunately has happened to a lot of people right now.
Good advice, Tanya. Simon, a victory for This Is Money on behalf of the family of an 82-year-old woman with dementia. Let's go there. They've won a refund on her care bills after unnecessarily paying £80 a month in top-up fees for 6 years. Take up the story.
Okay, so Rosemary Hanlon, who lives in a nursing home in the Wirral, became eligible for NHS funding due to her worsening health in 2016. But before that, she was funded by her local authority and paid extra to bridge a gap that the council wouldn't fund. Although it's worth noting she wasn't getting any upgrade on her room or her services. So afterwards, her family continued to pay the top-ups on her behalf without realising the NHS would be covering the bills for every aspect of her care. The discrepancy was discovered by the new owner of the care home after it changed hands earlier in the year. And Mrs. Hanlon's family attempted, quite rightly, to claim a refund on her behalf. Except, can you guess what happened next? Yep, her daughter, Annabelle Collins, contacted us after the new owner immediately agreed to refund £320, but said it was only responsible for overpayments since it took over in April. Meanwhile, the previous owner, whose current business operates, still had replied to say she was on holiday and be on touch on her return, and they got nowhere. After we asked both of the care home owners for comment, the previous owner paid £6,000 back to the family. Now, this illustrates a couple of things. One, that it would be nice if companies just did what they're meant to do and the right thing without us having to step in. Two, if you do think something is wrong and there is a problem, you should chase it up. And if you hit a sort of brick wall, then try and get some help. See if someone can help you. Keep going, keep pushing, because you might be right and you might be owed a substantial amount of money. And three, the need for families of those receiving full NHS care funding to make sure that they're not paying for anything that's already covered. And that's an issue that the family said that they really hope that this story could help flag up to people, because it could help others. It could help others realise that they're effectively paying for something that's already being paid for.
It's one of my big bugbears, Tanya, when it comes to your rights. And as personal finance consumer journalists as we are, we tell people to stand up for your rights and fight back. And these are the rules and these are the laws, etc. And there's an assumption that businesses and those sorts of people understand those and respect them and apply them. But they don't a lot of the time. And actually, really, there's not a lot you can do without employing the big guns of This Is Money. You need a company who is going to respond and understand the rules as well as you. Otherwise, you have a fight on your hands, which at times people might just think is just not worth it, and so they give up. Drives me mad.
Yes, I agree. And it's often when I'm covering a story and people have been banging their heads against a brick wall for absolutely months. And I just know that when I ring up and say I'm going to do a story about it, they will pull their finger out to get it sorted. Their press office basically gets involved and said, we need to say something to This Is Money about this. Probably the best thing we can say is we've got it sorted. So get it sorted. And all of a sudden, magically, the people get the refund. The massive dispute over a long-standing bill is suddenly resolved. The reason is discovered. It's usually human error, but nobody has bothered to investigate thoroughly until the press office rings up and says, This Is Money wants a comment in 2 days. What shall we say?
And I should add that this is a victory for the podcast, because Mrs. Collins wrote to us because she listens to the podcast. So I would say thank you to Mrs. Collins, A, for the nice email that she wrote when she asked for help, B, for listening to the podcast, and also C, for wanting to actively flag this issue so that other people could be aware that it could be affecting them. And that's a really important thing with these stories where we're trying to help people out, is we're trying to help people out, but we're also trying to stop it happening to other people and raise awareness. And it really, really helps us when somebody comes to us for help like that and says, look, please, can you help me? But also, I'd really like to help this not affect other people. So thank you to our listener, Mrs. Collins.
I actually spoke to Mrs. Collins, and this was really the main reason that she wanted the story. She was struggling to get the refund, but I think she was determined to carry on pushing and would have got there in the end. But she wanted to do it for her mother's sake, but also everybody else with elderly parents getting NHS continuing healthcare, which you only get when you're in really very, very serious ill health. The threshold is extremely high for it. She really wanted this story done for altruistic reasons, and since she's probably going to be listening to this at some point, I think we should pay tribute to her, as Simon has already done.
Absolutely, well done, and thank you very much. Finally, we're going to talk about mortgages and the dilemma that homeowners are facing at the moment. So those with spare cash to save are being given a new dilemma with interest rates soaring. Do they put their money into one of the top new savings accounts being launched, or do they try to pay off some of their mortgage to keep the cost of their debt down? Well, Tanya, I believe you are in a situation along these lines.
I do overpay on my mortgage, and I unfortunately on a fixed rate that is going to run out early next year. So I'm going to face this very dilemma. It is a really tricky one, but one of the things that I'm going to carry on trying to overpay if I can afford it, just because it really makes financial sense over the long term in terms of cutting the overall interest bill that you will pay long term. And I'm also bearing in mind that, I mean, inflation, we've discussed many times, is a real worry for people. It's causing real hardship, but for people who do borrow money, it is inflating away the real value of their debt, and that is going to give a boost to people paying off mortgages. But if you can afford to keep overpaying on top of that, and I'm leaning towards trying to, even if it means that I end up paying a lot extra, I just think over the long term, I think I'll sit back on the day that I finally pay off my mortgage and think I'm so glad I did this as quickly as possible and paid the least amount of interest. It will set me up much better for future life to have done that, even if it is potentially going to be painful at the moment.
Simon, your thoughts on this?
These are my thoughts on overpaying mortgages. Firstly, I think overpaying a mortgage is a good thing and a sensible thing for people to do. It's been a less sensible thing for people to do through the super low interest rate years after the financial crisis from a purely monetary point of view, whereby the rate of return that you could have got on your money instead of overpaying your mortgage has been, to beat that rate of return from overpaying your mortgage, has been lower. So say, for example, you've got a mortgage at 2%. If you invest the money instead, you only need to get more than 2% in order to be beating the effect of paying down your mortgage. Now, it's not quite that simple, but you can use that as a kind of benchmark level. But then you also have to factor in two things. One, tax. So overpaying your mortgage is quite tax efficient because the benefit that you get from overpaying the mortgage is not taxed, whereas the interest that you may earn on savings or the gains that you may make on investments are taxed, unless you do it in an ISA. Always try and do it in an ISA. And then also there's the psychological element, whereby I think is a very strong driver for people to still want to be mortgage free as early as possible, pay as little interest to the bank, get that mortgage cleared, and then have that extra money that they can do something with. If you talk to people who are quite financially sophisticated, by which I mean quite a lot of people who work in finance, investment, and so on, they've actually been very happy to have very large mortgages because they're on very low interest rates. And I know of people I've spoken to who have actively chosen to take out mortgages that are hundreds of thousands of pounds bigger than they needed to, because they'd rather have that money invested earning a higher rate of return. But those people are outliers, right? Those are not normal people. For normal people, I think if you can overpay a bit off the mortgage, then it's a good thing. But as Tanya said, and as this question says, the game has changed slightly. We're not in that super low interest rate world anymore. Interest rates are much higher. And the things that make a really big difference to whether it's worthwhile you overpaying your mortgage are the size of your mortgage, the interest rate that you're paying on your mortgage, and the length of your mortgage. So the shorter the mortgage term that you have left, the lifetime of the mortgage, the more you are paying off the debt rather than paying the interest. So the longer the mortgage, the more benefit you'll have from regularly overpaying. The higher the interest rate, we just talked about that, the higher the interest rate, the more interest you're going to save on paying to the bank. So depending on if you're paying 2% or 4%, that makes a big difference. And finally, the size of the mortgage. It goes without saying that's pretty obvious. So looking at the numbers, for someone with a big mortgage, for someone with a £300,000 mortgage, at an interest rate of 1.5%, which they could quite conceivably have fixed at not that long ago, and they've only got 10 years remaining on their mortgage, if they make regular overpayments of £300 a month, they will save £2,527 in interest over the rest of the life of their mortgage, and they'll clear the mortgage a year and a month early. But if you change that rate to 4.5%, which is a rate that they could conceivably be fixing at now, and keep everything else the same, they'll save £8,350 in interest. They'll still only cut the length of their mortgage by a year and 2 months, so they just get mortgage free 1 month earlier. But you can see the massive difference that makes in the amount of interest that they save. Then if we go back to the person, for example, who's managed to be lucky enough to fix on 1.5% on that same mortgage, if they only had 10 years left and they paid off an extra £300, they save £2,500 over the rest of the mortgage. Now, if they've got 20 years left on their mortgage, however, doing the calculations now, they would save £9,500 in interest and clear that mortgage 3 years and 11 months early. So you can see how having that longer mortgage makes a big difference. And then if we take the rate up as well and the longer mortgage, so now we're talking about someone who's got a £300,000 mortgage, a 4.5% interest rate, 20 years left, they overpay by £300 a month, they will save £34,400 in interest and get that mortgage cleared 4 years early. So you can see how those variables make a really big difference here. What you need to do is obviously check your mortgage rate, check the best savings rate you could get instead. If this is a genuine long-term game and you actually think, I'm going to keep doing this every single month for the next 10 years, maybe you don't want a savings account, maybe you invest the money instead, but you've got to accept that the value of those investments can go up and down. And the handy calculator that I have been using to do this is actually on London and Country's site, L&C Mortgages, which is This Is Money's mortgage partner. It has a mortgage overpayment calculator. And if you want to find out the best mortgage rate that you could apply for now, whether you're thinking of overpaying or whether you just want to know how much your mortgage payments might go up by, go to thisismoney.co.uk/mortgage-finder.
Thank you very much. That's it for this week. You can keep up to date with all the latest breaking money news. Just go to thisismoney.co.uk or download the app. And if you have any comments or questions for the team or anything you'd like them to look into, Simon.
You can email us at editor@thisismoney.co.uk. You can tweet us at thisismoney, or you can come to thisismoney.co.uk/podcast to find all podcast paths and join in the debate in reader comments.
And if you like our podcast, why not rate us wherever you found us? It helps other people find us too.
Market updates and conversations around the financial world don't have to be boring. The Digest and Invest podcast by eToro is a great way to tune into what's happening in a fun and easily digestible format. Discover the Digest and Invest podcast at etoro.com/academy/podcasts.